Consequences came quickly after last week's continuing resolution that avoided a government shutdown. Democrats across the country got angry, not only at Donald Trump and Republicans, they're upset with their leaders, namely Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. A lot of Democrats accuse Schumer of capitulating by going along with the spending package and giving more rope to Donald Trump to pursue his agenda. Republicans in Congress, led by the Trump administration, are clearly taking the country in a different direction. The continuing resolution is the latest example. We'll get into that and other changes this morning with Illinois Congressman LaHood. Welcome back to the program, Congressman.
Good to be with you, Jim.
Let's start with that continuing resolution that avoided a government shutdown. This was different than the other spending packages, resolutions that basically adopted in recent years that kicked the can down the road. Those kept spending levels the same. This one increases defense spending and makes cuts to non-defense programs. How surprised were you that Democrats in the Senate went along with it without exerting any leverage to try to keep the spending levels the same?
Well, we had an obligation and responsibility to make sure the government didn't shut down. We made it relatively a clean CR. We added, as you alluded to, Jim, a little money for defense to pay our soldiers. That's what the money went to. That was the plus up in defense. But I think, as President Trump alluded to, we wanted a clean CR that kept the government functioning through the end of this fiscal year. In the end, I'm glad Chuck Schumer and the Democrats decided not to shut down the government and keep it open. It allows us now to get on the important work that we need to get done for the American people.
Well, doesn't this also call for $880 billion in cuts to be made by the Energy and Commerce Committee as well?
Well, those cuts will be down the road, but that wasn't something that was encompassed into the CR. It's something that's been proposed as part of our budget reconciliation process, but not as part of the CR.
But let's say that is taken up in reconciliation, because you can do it in reconciliation with the Republicans in charge of the House and the Senate, and those cuts would be made over 10 years. Medicare and Medicaid do fall under its purview. Your party promises no cuts to those programs, but let's do the math, because the Congressional Budget Office indicates when you take out Medicare and Medicaid, it only leaves the committee with $581 billion worth of programs that could be cut. So let's say you wipe out that $581 billion. Republicans still have to cut $300 billion in either Medicaid, Medicare, or a combination of both. I guess, how can you and your party promise those programs won't be touched?
Well, you got to take President Trump at his word. He said he's not going to touch Social Security or Medicare. I think in the Medicaid space, what I've said is, if we can take a scalpel approach and not a sledgehammer approach, we ought to look at where we can move able-bodied working people to jobs and off Medicaid. That's one area to do it. How do you get I think looking at waste, fraud, and abuse is another area, Jim. In Medicaid, we can do that. But I don't think taking a sledgehammer approach to do that is the way that it should be done. And so we have to take a thoughtful approach on that. I will also say this would be a much different conversation that we're having, Jim, if we were $36 trillion in surplus, figuring out where to spend money, but we're not. And so members are acutely aware that we have to reverse the curse, as I call it, in our deficit spending. And I think we have an opportunity to do that in the budget reconciliation by having strong economic growth that brings more tax money into the federal treasury, creates more jobs, more higher wages, more people working, like we had during the first Trump term.
But you are indicating that cuts in Medicaid could be possible when you're talking about getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Those would be cuts technically, right?
Well, I look at those as efficiencies. If you're moving somebody that's on Medicaid to a job and you're saving money because they're no longer on Medicaid, but they have a working job and making money, I mean, that's what we ought to be doing in government. A lot of the programs that we have, particularly in our welfare system, I look at these as programs of they should be a trampoline to let people rise up and get a job, and not a hammock. And too many of our welfare programs are a hammock where people stay in it cycle after cycle. So let's figure out in a bipartisan way, similar to what Bill Clinton did with welfare reform and other Democrats have proposed doing. I think that's what we're looking at as a committee.
Now, President Trump's been active by imposing tariffs on our traditional trading partners after declaring an economic emergency. You serve on the powerful House and Ways Committee, House Ways and Means Committee, I should say. That has jurisdiction over tariffs. Do you support these tariffs?
Well, tariffs can be used in a strategic and tactical way, and I'll give you an example of that. When you have a country like China that cheats and steals, takes our intellectual property, plays by a different set of rules and standards than every other industrialized country in the world, then you have to take action, because clearly they're not going to do that on their own, and we've seen many examples of that. So using tariffs against China, we should be doing that, and the president has talked about doing that. I do have concerns, Jim, particularly in our ag sector, particularly in manufacturing, when you impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico, two of our biggest trading partners. We have a trade agreement with them. To me, tariffs can be taxes, taxes on my farmers, my constituents, my business owners. And so that concerns me. Long-term tariff policy, I don't think is good for trade.
Well, House Democrats recently tried to challenge the president's economic emergency through a procedural tool. That tool required a vote in the House on this emergency in 15 days and put every representative, including yourself, on the record about the president's tariffs. But Republicans blocked that by passing a resolution that says this legislative session won't be counted as any days, making it impossible to get to those 15 days required for a vote. I know you can't be 56 forever. How afraid are you or your fellow Republicans from going on the record against the president's actions here regarding tariffs? You express your own concerns regarding Mexico and Canada and even Europe, right?
Well, I've spoken out on behalf of my district and my farmers when it comes to tariffs. And what I just told you, I've told to the president and his team. I've done it on national media, and I'll continue to look out for the best interests of my district. But again, when you have countries like China that skirt the rules and engage in the type of activity that they do, you have to take action against them. And tariffs, unfortunately, the only way to do that. I also have concerns with the amount of fentanyl that's come across our southern border. If Mexico can curtail the cartels, curtail some of the violence, then those tariffs should be lifted. But predicating economic policy on tariffs alone, I don't think is the best approach.
Now, there's been very little fentanyl coming from Canada, by the way. We've seen the Department of Government Efficiency, under the management of Elon Musk, fire thousands of federal employees with approval from the president, essentially. Jobs paid for with money approved by Congress. Only an act of Congress is allowed to do that. A letter sent recently to congressional leaders from 60 former members of Congress called on Congress to exercise its authority in the Constitution to stop one person from taking control of the government. One of those former members to sign that letter, your father, Ray LaHood, a Republican. Why is your father worried about this and you seemingly not?
Well, I think it's interesting that when you look at the DOGE Commission, stands for Department of Government Efficiency. I think in a bipartisan way, we ought to be looking at how do we trim the federal deficit. Jim, this would be a much different conversation, again, if we were $36 trillion in surplus. We're not. So I don't understand what the big deal is in having a different set of eyes that's been successful in the private sector that is looking at how do we trim government? How do we find waste, fraud, and abuse? Because clearly Congress has not been able to do anything. Administration after administration has not been able to do anything. Think about this year for fiscal year 25. We're going to spend $7 trillion. We're only going to bring in $5 trillion. Now, if you were, if that was the way you ran your family business or your own personal finances, you'd be in jail or bankruptcy court. But the federal government's allowed to do it. So let's give DOGE the opportunity to come up. Let's see what they come up with. Let them do their auditing and figure out the suggestions they have. Then we'll have to make those decisions by voting on those proposed cuts. But I wish people wouldn't be getting carried away with potentially what this would do when, in fact, we have to do something about reversing the curse of deficit spending.
Well, 2 points. First of all, the government is not a business technically, but you're also suggesting that DOGE is going in there and trimming things. They're going in and firing people, thousands of people making decisions arbitrarily without conducting these audits, as you suggest, and making recommendations later. They're cutting first and asking questions later.
Well, I would push back on that, Jim. Probationary people that aren't full-time federal employees, that's different. And there's been many exemptions put in place. None of those employees probationary that are involved with law enforcement or national security are being fired or let go. But again, having a conversation about where we can cut back when we're $36 trillion in debt, I view that as it should be a positive thing, at least initially. But the 95% of the proposed cuts are going to have to be voted on by Congress.
Illinois Congressman Darren LaHood, always enjoy the conversation. Good luck with everything in D.C.